The room was filled with a sense of anticipation. A group of black farmers, dressed in their usual attire of boots and worn-in denim, had been invited to a gathering of political figures and industry leaders. The event, held in Washington, D.C., was a place for networking, discussing policy changes, and, ideally, securing more resources for agriculture. But what no one expected was the impact these humble farmers would soon have, particularly when their conversation turned to a subject that had been long overlooked in the agricultural world. Barack Obama, in attendance as part of a new initiative aimed at supporting American agriculture, was in his usual element. His charm, wit, and easy demeanor were evident as he mingled with the crowd, shaking hands, offering jokes, and exuding confidence. As a former president, he had seen the struggles of farmers firsthand. He knew the importance of agriculture in America. He knew about the hardships, the challenges, and the policy decisions that had shaped the industry over the years. But what Obama didn't know was that a group of farmers seated at one of the back tables controlled an industry worth billions. The farmers, led by Marcellus Johnson, a seasoned entrepreneur and agricultural innovator, had a long history in farming. Their land stretched across several states, producing crops that were vital not just to local economies, but to the global food supply. The group had fought for decades to build their businesses, facing systemic racism, limited access to resources, and a lack of recognition. But what they had built was undeniable. Marcellus, along with his colleagues, had developed a sophisticated network of farms, processing facilities, and distribution channels. They weren't just small-time farmers. They were a billion-dollar industry, quietly shaping the future of agriculture without the widespread attention or acknowledgement they deserved. But that was about to change. All it would take was one misstep from a prominent figure, and their carefully constructed empire would begin to make headlines. As Obama walked past the group, he couldn't resist making a joke. With a grin, he gestured toward the farmers and quipped, "Well, I see you folks still working hard in the fields. Hope you're getting a little more than just your hands dirty these days." The room chuckled, and Obama's charisma held everyone in his sway. It was, after all, a harmless joke, one that lightly poked fun at the nature of hard labor that so many farmers faced. But for Marcellus and his team, the comment stung. It wasn't just the lightheartedness of the remark that bothered them. It was the subtle way Obama had dismissed them. He hadn't realized, of course, that the very people he was joking about were not only financially independent, but were quietly driving the agricultural economy forward. They weren't just laborers. They were business owners, investors, and power players in an industry that generated billions every year. Marcellus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. He could feel the weight of the moment, the injustice of it. For so long, black farmers had been overlooked, their contributions minimized, their success treated as an anomaly rather than the foundation of an entire industry. It wasn't just a joke. It was yet another reminder of how deeply ingrained the narrative of black farmers as underdogs and laborers was in the public consciousness. As the laughter from the crowd died down, Marcellus felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't one to back down, especially when it came to his people and their achievements. This was a moment of reckoning. The group of farmers had put years of work into building their empire, and now, it was time for the world to see who they really were. Not just a group of hardworking laborers, but the backbone of an industry that was crucial to the American economy. After a few moments of quiet reflection, Marcellus stood up. His presence, commanding yet calm, immediately drew the attention of the room. He wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but when it was time to speak, his voice carried weight. He turned toward Obama and addressed him directly. "Mr. President," Marcellus began, his tone respectful but firm, "I'm glad you find humor in our work. But the truth is, what you're looking at here isn't just hard labor. It's an industry that's worth billions of dollars. We don't just plant crops. We build businesses, we create jobs, and we contribute to the economy in ways that are often overlooked." Obama's smile faltered for just a second. It was clear that he hadn't expected this response. The room grew quiet, and the mood shifted. What had started as a jovial interaction was now turning into something far more serious. Obama, ever the politician, quickly recovered, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Oh," Obama asked, his voice shifting slightly. "Well, I'll admit, I didn't know that. I assumed you were just one of the many small farmers across the country, struggling to make ends meet. You know, agriculture's a tough business. Marcellus nodded, understanding that Obama's words, though candid, were rooted in a lack of awareness. The truth was that many people, including politicians and industry leaders, still viewed black farmers as marginal players in the agricultural landscape. The history of racism and exclusion in the farming community had created a narrative where black farmers were relegated to the background, their success often overshadowed by the myth of farming as a white man's business. But Marcellus and his team had spent decades defying that narrative. "We're not just struggling," Marcellus replied. "We've built a billion-dollar industry. Our farms, our businesses, our network, it's all part of a much larger picture. The agriculture industry may look one way on the surface, but there's an entire world beneath that. A world that has been built by people who've been ignored for far too long." The tension in the room was palpable now. Obama, for all his political prowess, had been caught off guard. He had assumed that farmers, especially black farmers, were still working in the shadows, struggling to survive. But Marcellus was telling him something different. The farmers in front of him weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And Obama, for the first time in years, felt a sense of unease. This wasn't just a conversation about policy or economy. It was a wake-up call about a reality he hadn't fully grasped. Marcellus continued, his voice gaining strength. "We've been in this game for years, building something that supports not just our families, but entire communities. We provide jobs, we shape markets, and we feed this country. Our work is invaluable, and it's time people recognize that." The room was still silent, everyone now fully engaged in what Marcellus was saying. The farmers had no interest in grandstanding or seeking validation. But in this moment, with Obama's attention firmly on them, they had the opportunity to do what they'd been waiting for. To remind the world and the former president that they were a force to be reckoned with. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The playful atmosphere that had once surrounded Obama's joke had turned into something much more intense. Marcellus stood tall, his words ringing clear in the quiet space. There was no mistaking the fact that he had just challenged Obama, one of the most respected political figures in the country, and had demanded that the real power of black farmers be acknowledged. The former president, who had spent years advocating for farmers, was now standing face to face with a reality that many in the room had overlooked for far too long. Obama, now fully aware that his comment had touched a nerve, raised his hands in a gesture of recognition. He wasn't one to shy away from a confrontation, especially when it came to something as important as the state of American agriculture. But as he looked at the group of farmers, he saw something he hadn't expected, a fire that went beyond the typical conversation of policy and economic struggles. Marcellus had been right. These farmers weren't just participants in the system. They were shaping it. They weren't just surviving. They were driving the future of the industry, and Obama realized that he had underestimated them. "I'll be honest with you," Obama began, the tone of his voice shifting to one of genuine curiosity. "I didn't know. I've met many farmers, but I didn't know the scale of what you're doing. I guess I've been caught up in the narrative I've heard for so long. That's my mistake." The room, which had been tense moments before, now filled with a strange sense of understanding. Obama's acknowledgement, though simple, was a powerful moment. For too long, black farmers had been on the periphery, their contributions overlooked or minimized by a system that was quick to categorize them as small-time or marginal. But now, they had Obama's attention. And more importantly, they had the opportunity to change the conversation, not just for themselves, but for countless others who had been living in the shadows of the industry. Marcellus nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It's not about mistakes, Mr. President. It's about awareness. We've been here, building this. We've had to fight every step of the way to get the resources, the recognition, and the respect we deserve. But we're not asking for sympathy. We're asking for opportunity." Obama looked at Marcellus with a newfound respect. He had always known that black farmers faced challenges, but he had never truly understood the depth of those challenges. He had heard the stories about land taken from families, about systemic barriers that made it difficult for black farmers to thrive, about the lack of support from the government and private sector. But hearing Marcellus speak, Hearing the passion in his voice and the conviction in his words, Obama realized just how much had been left unsaid and just how much had been ignored. "What can we do to help?" Obama asked, his tone now sincere. "What kind of support do you need to take this to the next level?" Marcellus smiled, though it was a thoughtful, almost reflective smile. He knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment when their hard work, their struggles, and their ambitions would no longer be ignored. The moment when they would be seen as more than just farmers. They would be seen as powerful players in an industry that could no longer afford to dismiss them. "It's not just about resources, Mr. President," Marcellus replied. "It's about policy. It's about creating a space where farmers like us can have a seat at the table. We need access to capital, access to land, and we need a government that doesn't treat us as an afterthought. We need a change in how we're viewed and treated. Our businesses aren't just farms. They're empires that are helping to shape the future of this country." Obama nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. You've been fighting against a system that's been stacked against you from the start. And it's clear now that you've built something that's not only successful but essential. We have to start acknowledging that." The conversation between Marcellus and Obama continued, diving deeper into the specifics of what needed to change. They talked about access to funding, about how black farmers had been historically excluded from government subsidies and loans that were given to their white counterparts. They discussed the importance of representation, how black farmers needed more advocates in positions of power to push for policy changes that would level the playing field. As the conversation progressed, the other farmers in the room began to chime in, adding their voices to the discussion. It wasn't just about money or resources. It was about creating a new framework for how agriculture was approached in America. Black farmers were not asking for handouts, but for the same opportunities that had been extended to others for generations. They were asking to be seen as equals, to be treated with the same respect and given the same chances to succeed. "We're not asking for anything that hasn't been earned," said Tanya Johnson, a third-generation farmer and one of Marcellus's closest allies. "We've been doing the work. We've been building this industry from the ground up. All we need is the support to help us grow." Obama listened intently, his mind working through the challenges ahead. He had always been a strong advocate for equality, but this conversation was different. It was a reminder that even within movements for social justice, there were still pockets of resistance, still places where the systems of power had not yet fully embraced the idea of equality. "I hear you," Obama said, his voice filled with resolve. "I can't promise overnight changes, but I can promise that I'll work with you. We need to address these issues head-on, and I'll make sure this conversation doesn't stop here." As the meeting came to an end, Marcellus felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about Obama's words. It was about the fact that he had listened. The conversation had shifted from a casual joke to a serious, substantive discussion about real change. The black farmers had made their point. They were no longer to be underestimated, and their contributions to the agricultural industry were too significant to be ignored any longer. The work wasn't over, of course. There were still countless obstacles to overcome. But as Marcellus and his team left the room, they knew that the seeds for change had been planted. What had begun as a joke about farmers in the fields had turned into a moment of reckoning, one that would have ripple effects across the agricultural world. The next chapter in the fight for equality, recognition, and opportunity had just begun. The days following the meeting in Washington were a whirlwind of activity for Marcellus and his fellow farmers. What had begun as a simple conversation had quickly become a national talking point, with news outlets covering the unexpected exchange between the former president and the black farmers who had quietly controlled a billion-dollar empire. Marcellus and his team were no strangers to media attention, but this was different. This wasn't about their personal success. It was about a movement, a revolution in how black farmers were seen and treated in the agricultural industry. The conversation with Obama had ignited something in the farming community. The farmers who had once struggled in silence, often overlooked and dismissed by the larger agricultural world, were now being recognized for the power and influence they had long held. And this recognition wasn't just in the form of headlines. It was turning into action. Politicians, industry leaders, and even investors were now calling Marcellus and his colleagues, eager to understand more about their work and how they could help reshape the future of farming. For Marcellus, this newfound attention was both exciting and overwhelming. He had worked tirelessly for years to create a sustainable business model that not only supported his own family but had given opportunities to other black farmers who had faced similar challenges. But now, with the weight of this movement upon him, he knew the pressure was on. It wasn't enough to simply continue the work. They had to change the entire landscape of agriculture, pushing for policies that would create lasting change. One of the first steps Marcellus and his team took was to meet with key political figures to discuss the changes that needed to be made and how agriculture was regulated and supported. They pushed for policies that would provide better access to land, capital, and markets for black farmers. They also demanded that the government take a closer look at how resources were distributed, advocating for equal access to government loans, grants, and subsidies. The political landscape was a tough battleground, but Marcellus was determined. He knew that their work wasn't just about getting a seat at the table. It was about changing the rules of the game. For too long, black farmers had been left out of policy decisions that directly impacted their ability to thrive. Now, with the national spotlight on them, they had a real chance to alter the course of history. As the movement gained momentum, more and more black farmers across the country began to speak out, sharing their stories of resilience, innovation, and success. These farmers, who had been marginalized for so long, were now joining forces, demanding their rightful place in the agricultural world. The days of being dismissed as mere laborers were over. They were entrepreneurs, business owners, and industry leaders, and they were no longer willing to accept the status quo. At the same time, Marcellus and his colleagues were also focused on educating the public about the importance of black farmers in the economy. They knew that if they could shift public perception, they could change the way the industry was structured. They organized events, workshops, and conferences to highlight the role that black farmers played in feeding the nation and driving economic growth. The narrative was no longer about struggling farmers. It was about thriving businesses that were essential to the future of agriculture. Marcellus's conversation with Obama had ignited a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The attention and recognition that followed were just the beginning. The real work, he knew, was in the long-term fight for equity and access. It wasn't enough to change policy. It was about changing attitudes, breaking down the systemic barriers that had long kept black farmers from realizing their full potential. For Obama, the conversation with Marcellus had also sparked a deeper reflection on his own time in office. He had worked on issues of racial inequality, but as he looked back, he realized that he had overlooked the specific needs of black farmers. He had pushed for reforms that helped many communities, but he hadn't fully understood the depth of the challenges faced by black farmers in particular. The encounter with Marcellus had opened his eyes to a whole new set of issues that required immediate attention. In the months that followed, Obama became a vocal supporter of the movement. He used his platform to raise awareness about the struggles of black farmers and the importance of supporting their businesses. He worked with Marcellus and other leaders to push for policy changes that would ensure better access to resources for black farmers and help level the playing field. The two men, once on opposite sides of a lighthearted joke, had become allies in the fight for equity in agriculture. As the momentum of the movement continued to build, Marcellus found himself at the center of a larger conversation about race, agriculture, and economic power. He was no longer just a farmer. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope for black farmers across the nation. But he was also aware of the responsibility that came with this newfound visibility. The work was far from over, and there were many battles still to be fought. But for the first time, Marcellus felt that the future of black farmers had the potential to be brighter than ever before. The struggle was not just about gaining recognition. It was about creating a system where black farmers could thrive without facing the systemic challenges that had held them back for generations. The road ahead would be difficult, but Marcellus was resolute. He had spent his life building an empire from the ground up, and now, with the support of Obama, political allies, and the growing movement of black farmers, he was ready to change the entire landscape of agriculture. As the national conversation evolved, Marcellus and his team continued to push for the changes they had long been advocating for. They weren't just fighting for the future of their own businesses. They were fighting for a future where black farmers could finally be seen, heard, and respected as equal contributors to the American economy. It wasn't just about the billion-dollar industry they had built. It was about the millions of black farmers who had yet to realize their full potential. The story of Marcellus and his team of black farmers was no longer just about a group of entrepreneurs who had overcome adversity. It had become a story of revolution, of a shift in power that would alter the fabric of the agricultural industry for generations to come. And with every step forward, the farmers knew they were not just changing the way people saw them. They were changing the future of farming itself.